Chapter 1, The Archivist's Routine. The basement of the National Records Administration building smelled like old paper and broken promises. Margaret Chen had worked there for 17 years, and she'd long since stopped noticing the particular mustiness that clung to everything: the files, the furniture, the faded cardboard boxes stacked in rows that stretched back into shadows the fluorescent lights never quite reached. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when she arrived at her desk, the same desk she'd occupied since 2007, its surface scarred with coffee rings and the ghost impressions of 10,000 forms pressed hard by ballpoint pens. The building sat on a forgettable street in a forgettable part of Washington, the kind of place tourists never photographed, where mid-level bureaucrats moved through their days with the steady rhythm of factory workers. Margaret set down her thermos, always the same thermos, dented silver with a blue grip, and removed her cardigan. The basement was always cold, even in summer, but September brought a particular chill that seeped up through the linoleum floor. She was 53 years old, though people often guessed younger, her black hair still mostly untouched by gray, pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn since graduate school. "Morning, Margaret," called James from 2 rows over. James Whitmore, 26 years with the administration, a man whose entire personality could be summarized by his collection of novelty ties. Today's featured cartoon filing cabinets with smiling faces. "Morning," she replied, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who'd had this exact exchange 5,000 times before. She logged into her computer. The password was the same one she'd been using for 6 years, changed only when the system forced her to add another number at the end, and opened her queue. 53 documents awaited processing. Freedom of Information Act requests, most of them. Someone wanted to know something, and it was her job to decide how much of that something they were allowed to learn. Margaret had made peace with this work long ago. She'd come to the National Records Administration with different dreams, fresh out of her master's program in archival science, believing she would be a guardian of history, a keeper of truth. She'd imagined herself carefully preserving the documentary evidence of great events, making the past accessible to scholars and citizens alike. The reality had been different, of course. It always was. She pulled up the first file in her queue, a request from a freelance journalist named David Rosen for documents related to a 1987 incident at a chemical facility in Montana. The file had already been through preliminary review by the agency of origin, in this case, the Environmental Protection Agency. Her job was secondary review, ensuring that nothing sensitive slipped through, that all the proper exemptions had been applied. Margaret opened the scanned documents. There were 47 pages total. She began reading. The first page was a memo, dated March 15, 1987, from a facility manager to a regional supervisor. Or rather, it had been a memo. Now it was a memo-shaped object, a ghost of communication. Every third word had been replaced with a black rectangle. The subject line was completely obscured. The signature was redacted. Even the letterhead had been partially blacked out. She moved to the second page. An incident report. More black rectangles, these ones longer, covering entire paragraphs. She could make out fragments, at approximately, and, resulted in, and, immediate evacuation of, but the actual substance, what had happened, to whom, why, existed only in the spaces where information used to be. This wasn't unusual. Margaret processed documents like this every day. National security, personal privacy, proprietary business information, law enforcement techniques. The law provided 9 exemptions that allowed agencies to withhold information, and they used them liberally. Sometimes she thought the exemptions were used more than they should be, that government secrecy had a way of expanding to fill all available space, like a gas. But these thoughts were idle, momentary. They didn't change anything. She worked her way through the file methodically, checking each redaction against the agency's stated justification. Most were coded as B5, interagency or intra-agency memorandums or letters that would not be available by law to a party other than an agency in litigation with the agency. Deliberative process privilege, they called it. Protecting the government's ability to have frank internal discussions. 17 years of this. 17 years of black rectangles and coded exemptions and the careful parsing of what could be known versus what must remain hidden. Margaret had developed a kind of professional numbness to it, the way a surgeon develops numbness to the sight of blood. But something about this particular file nagged at her. She couldn't quite articulate what it was. The redaction seemed heavier than usual, more complete. Page after page offered nothing but fragments, sentence shards that gestured toward meaning without ever achieving it. The exposure levels, one line red, followed by 3 inches of solid black. Children in the surrounding area, began another paragraph, before disappearing into redaction. Margaret sat back in her chair, which creaked with familiar complaint. Around her, the basement hummed with its usual sounds, the ventilation system's perpetual rattle, James humming tunelessly while he worked, the distant rumble of the freight elevator that brought new files down from the upper floors. She pulled up the request form again. David Rosen, the journalist, had included a brief explanation of why he wanted the documents. His mother had worked at the Montana facility in question. She died of cancer in 1994, at 41 years old. Other former workers from the facility had died young as well. He'd counted at least 11, all of cancer, all before the age of 55. He was trying to understand what had happened there. Margaret looked back at the redacted documents. 47 pages that said almost nothing. She imagined David Rosen receiving them, this man she'd never met, sitting at his desk somewhere, opening the envelope, pulling out page after page of black rectangles, searching desperately for his mother in the spaces between the obscured text. She'd learned not to think about the people who made the requests. It was easier that way. They weren't real to her, just names on forms, case numbers in her queue. But sometimes, despite her best defenses, they became real anyway. Margaret glanced at the clock in the corner of her screen. 9:47. She'd been at work for 47 minutes. She had 52 more documents in her queue. This was her life. This had been her life for 17 years. This would be her life until retirement, another 12 years away, unless she died first, like David Rosen's mother, like the 11 other workers from a facility whose very name had been redacted from most of the documents. She approved the redactions. She always approved the redactions. That was her job. But as she moved the file out of her queue and pulled up the next one, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, the small, uncomfortable stirring of doubt. Outside, above the basement where she worked, the city moved through its Tuesday morning. People bought coffee and complained about traffic and kissed their children goodbye at school drop-off. The sun was shining, probably. Margaret couldn't see it from down here, but she imagined it anyway, bright and indifferent in a cloudless sky. Chapter 2, The Pattern Emerges. The doubt didn't leave. Margaret tried to ignore it through the rest of Tuesday, through Wednesday morning staff meeting where they discussed updated protocols for processing drone strike records, through the sandwich she ate alone at her desk on Wednesday afternoon, turkey and Swiss, the same sandwich she brought from home 4 days a week. But Thursday morning, when she opened her queue, there it was again. A new FOIA request, different journalist, different facility. This time it was a manufacturing plant in Ohio, 1991. Someone named Patricia Whitfield wanted records about groundwater contamination near her childhood home. The file contained 62 pages. Margaret began her review. Black rectangles everywhere. The name of the contaminating chemical, redacted. The levels found in local wells, redacted. The company's internal communications about the problem, almost entirely redacted. Even the maps showing the affected area had been obscured, rendered into abstract compositions of blocked-out space. She sat very still, her hand resting on the mouse. This was different from the Montana file only in its specifics. The pattern was identical. Maximum redaction, minimum disclosure. Documents released in a form that technically complied with the law while revealing essentially nothing. Margaret pulled up her work log from the past month. She'd processed 217 FOIA requests in 30 days. She began scrolling through them, randomly selecting files she'd already approved, looking at them again with different eyes. A request for documents about a pharmaceutical trial from 1989, 40 pages, 38 of them more black than white. A request for records about a military base's waste disposal practices, 71 pages of fragmentary sentences floating in seas of redaction. A request for communications between the Department of Energy and a private contractor, the entire file reduced to letterheads and dates, every word of substance obscured. It had always been this way, hadn't it? Margaret tried to remember. When she'd started in 2007, had the redactions been this heavy? Or had they grown gradually, so slowly she hadn't noticed? Like the apocryphal frog in the pot of water, the temperature rising 1 degree at a time until you were boiling without ever having felt the change. She thought about calling someone. But who? James, with his novelty ties and his unwavering curiosity. Her supervisor, Rita Clarkson, who'd been with the administration for 32 years and whose primary concern was keeping their processing times within acceptable parameters. Margaret closed the files and sat back. The basement's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound she'd stopped hearing years ago but could suddenly perceive again, insistent and irritating. That evening, she did something she almost never did, she brought work home with her. Not physical files, that would violate protocol, but the questions, the unease, the nagging sense that something was wrong. Her apartment was in Silver Spring, a one-bedroom place she'd lived in for 9 years, decorated in a style that could generously be called minimal, and more accurately described as Spartan. She made herself dinner, pasta with Jared sauce, and ate it while staring at her laptop screen, searching. She started with David Rosen, the journalist who'd requested the Montana facility documents. His website was basic, professional. He wrote mostly for regional publications, occasional pieces for national outlets. Environmental health stories, workplace safety investigations, the kind of journalism that didn't win prizes but served a purpose. She found his article about the Montana facility. It had been published 3 months ago in a magazine called The Public Record. He'd written it even without the documents he'd requested, relying instead on interviews with former workers and their families, on local news reports from 1987, on his own memories of his mother coming home from work with headaches she couldn't explain. 11 workers dead of cancer. 14 others with serious illnesses. All of them had worked in Building 7 during a 6-month period in 1987. None of them had been told what chemicals they were handling. The company that owned the facility had been dissolved in 1993, its assets sold, its records supposedly destroyed. Margaret read the article twice. Then she searched for Patricia Whitfield. Whitfield wasn't a journalist. She was a high school teacher in Columbus, Ohio, who'd started asking questions after her younger brother died of leukemia at 37. She'd created a website, crude but comprehensive, documenting the cancer cluster in her childhood neighborhood. 43 people within a half-mile radius of the old manufacturing plant had developed cancer before the age of 50. The site featured photos, smiling children from the 1980s, school pictures and birthday parties, Little League teams. Beneath each photo, dates. Birth and death, or birth and diagnosis. The manufacturing plant had closed in 1998. The site had been cleared and sold to a developer. Condominiums now stood where Building 6 had been, where Patricia's website claimed the contamination had originated. Margaret felt something cold settling in her stomach. She spent the next 3 hours searching through her own mental archive, trying to remember other requests she'd processed, other files she'd approved. The pharmaceutical trial, she searched for that too. Found a blog post by a woman whose father had been a test subject, who developed aggressive organ failure at 49. The military base, found a local news investigation from 5 years ago about elevated cancer rates in the surrounding community. Everywhere she looked, she found the same thing, people asking questions, trying to understand what had happened to them, to their families, to their communities. And between them and the answers stood documents redacted beyond recognition. Margaret closed her laptop at 11:30. Her pasta had gone cold hours ago, congealed in the bowl on her coffee table. She thought about going to bed, but knew she wouldn't sleep. Instead, she opened her laptop again and began making a list. Every heavily redacted file she could remember from the past month. The request details, the agencies involved, the nature of the incidents in question. She worked from memory, her 17 years of processing documents having trained her to retain information even when she didn't consciously intend to. By 1 in the morning, she had 47 entries. By 2, 63. The list grew. Chemical exposures, pharmaceutical trials, industrial accidents, military operations, waste disposal, groundwater contamination. Different places, different times, different requesters. But always the same result, documents so heavily redacted that the truth remained hidden, buried under black rectangles and exemption codes. Margaret saved the file and named it pattern.doc. She sat in her dark apartment, the only light coming from her laptop screen, and wondered what she was supposed to do with this pattern now that she'd seen it. The doubt had become something else. Something harder to ignore. Something that felt uncomfortably like responsibility. Outside her window, Silver Spring slept. Traffic lights cycled through their colors for empty streets. A police siren wailed in the distance, then faded. Margaret thought about David Rosen's mother, dead at 41. About Patricia Whitfield's brother, dead at 37. About all the people in all the photographs on all the websites she'd found tonight, their lives truncated by exposures they'd never been warned about, by dangers documented in files they'd never be allowed to fully read. She'd spent 17 years being neutral. Professional. Detached. That neutrality was beginning to feel like complicity. Chapter 3, The Archive Within the Archive. Margaret arrived at work Friday morning with a plan that wasn't quite a plan, more a direction, a compass pointing towards something she couldn't yet name. She went through her usual routine, thermos on the desk, cardigan on the chair, computer login, but her hands were shaking slightly as she typed her password. She'd barely slept. The list she'd made kept scrolling through her mind, 63 files, 63 instances of truth obscured. She needed to know if the pattern went deeper. The National Records Administration maintained two systems. There was the active processing system, where current FOIA requests lived, where Margaret did her daily work. And then there was the archive system, the vast digital repository of every request they'd ever processed, going back decades. Millions of documents. Millions of decisions about what could be known and what must remain hidden. Margaret had access to both systems. Everyone in her department did. But the archive was rarely searched, there was no reason to, really. Once a request was processed and fulfilled, it became historical record, filed away, forgotten. She opened the archive system and sat looking at the search interface. The cursor blinked in the empty field, waiting. She started with date ranges. 1980 to 1990. Subject categories: environmental incidents, industrial accidents, public health. She added search terms: chemical exposure, contamination, facility, workers. The system took 43 seconds to process the search. 2,817 results. Margaret felt her breath catch. She refined the search, filtering for files where redactions exceeded 50% of the total document content. The number dropped, 1,406. She began opening files at random. A 1983 incident at a pesticide plant in Arkansas. 40 workers hospitalized. The documents describing what chemical they'd been exposed to, entirely redacted. The company's safety protocols, redacted. The government inspector's recommendations, redacted. A 1986 pharmaceutical trial in Michigan. Unexplained deaths among test subjects. The drug being tested, redacted. The side effects observed, heavily redacted. The decision about whether to continue the trial, redacted. A 1989 military exercise in Nevada. Civilian complaints about illness in nearby towns. The nature of the exercise, redacted. The materials used, redacted. The military's internal assessment of health risks, redacted. Margaret worked through her lunch break, her sandwich forgotten. James asked if she was feeling okay. She'd been staring at her screen for 3 hours without moving. She told him she was fine, just working on a complicated file. By mid-afternoon, she'd examined 73 archived cases. The pattern wasn't just consistent. It was systematic. Every file involved potential harm to civilians. Every file involved government agencies or private contractors working with government oversight. And every file had been redacted to the point of meaninglessness, released in a form that technically satisfied the law while ensuring that no one could actually understand what had happened. She thought about the exemptions, the 9 categories that allowed information to be withheld. National security. Commercial confidentiality. Privacy. Deliberative process. They were meant to be narrow exceptions to a general rule of transparency. But in practice, they'd become tools for ensuring that transparency never actually occurred. Margaret pulled up the Montana file again, David Rosen's request about his mother. She looked at it with new understanding. This wasn't just one file that happened to be heavily redacted. This was part of a pattern spanning decades, a systematic effort to prevent people from knowing what had been done to them. She thought about her role in it. 17 years of reviewing redactions, approving them, moving files through the system. 17 years of being the mechanism through which truth was buried. Her hands were trembling again. She needed evidence. Not just the pattern she'd observed, but proof. Something concrete. Something that would show not just that documents were being redacted, but that they were being redacted inappropriately, that information was being hidden that should be public. The problem was access. She could see the redacted documents, but she couldn't see the original, unredacted versions. Those lived in the agency files, behind additional layers of security and classification. She was secondary review, downstream from the decisions about what to black out. She saw only what others had already decided she should see. But there were exceptions. Sometimes, rarely, a document would come through with provisional redactions, flagged for secondary review because the primary reviewer was uncertain. In those cases, Margaret would see both versions, the original and the proposed redacted form, so she could make a determination about whether the redactions were appropriate. She searched the archive for provisional reviews from the past 5 years. Found 238 cases. Started opening them. Most were routine. A name redacted when it should have been public. A date unnecessarily obscured. Minor discrepancies easily resolved. But then, buried in a file from 18 months ago, she found something else. A request for documents about a 2003 incident at a research facility in New Mexico. The primary reviewer had flagged 3 pages for secondary review, uncertain about whether certain technical details should be classified as proprietary business information. Margaret opened the unredacted version. She read it once, quickly. Then again, slowly. The facility had been conducting experiments on behalf of the Department of Defense, testing the long-term effects of low-level radiation exposure. The test subjects were listed as volunteers, but the document made clear they'd been recruited from a nearby homeless shelter, paid $50 each, never told what they were actually being exposed to. 12 of the 17 subjects had developed cancer within 10 years. The document included their names, their medical histories, the detailed progression of their illnesses. All of this had been redacted in the final version released to the requester. Every name, every medical detail, every indication that human subjects had been used. What remained was a sterile discussion of experimental protocols and data collection methodologies, scrubbed of all evidence of harm. The justification code was B6, Personal Privacy Exemption. Protecting the identities of the test subjects. But the test subjects were dead. All 17 of them. Margaret could see their death dates in the unredacted version, could see that the last one had died in 2016, a year before the FOIA request was even made. You couldn't violate the privacy of the dead. The exemption didn't apply. Yet the redactions had been approved. By her predecessor, by the supervisor at that time, by everyone in the chain of review. The document had been released in its neutered form, and whoever had requested it, Margaret checked the name, Elizabeth Torres, daughter of one of the test subjects, had received nothing that could tell her what had actually happened to her father. Margaret sat very still in her cold basement office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the archive of systematic deception glowing on her screen. She finally understood what she was looking at. This wasn't bureaucratic caution. This wasn't legitimate need for secrecy. This was cover-up, institutionalized and routine, performed by people like her who'd convinced themselves they were just following protocol, just doing their jobs, just keeping the machine running smoothly. The truth had been there all along, hidden in plain sight within the very system designed to reveal it. Chapter 4, The Decision. Margaret printed the file. She did it at 4:47 on Friday afternoon, when most of the office had already started their weekend drift toward the exits, when James was in the break room making his ritual end-of-week coffee, when the printer room was empty and quiet. The unredacted New Mexico document. 17 pages. 17 names. 17 lives reduced to data points in an experiment they'd never agreed to. She watched the pages emerge from the printer, still warm, the text sharp and clear with nothing obscured. Evidence. Proof that the system wasn't just flawed but deliberately corrupted, that the redactions weren't protecting legitimate secrets but hiding crimes. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a violation. Removing classified materials from a secure facility was a federal offense. She could lose her job, her security clearance, possibly face prosecution. 17 years of careful, compliant service erased in a single act of theft. She picked up the pages, still warm from the printer. Held them against her chest where no security camera could see. The walk back to her desk felt like miles. Every footstep echoed. Every corner might hide a supervisor, a security guard, someone who would ask what she was carrying, why her hands were shaking, why her face had gone pale. But the basement was nearly empty. Friday afternoon exodus. Everyone eager to forget this place for 2 days. Margaret slid the pages into her bag, a brown canvas tote she'd carried for years, so familiar it was invisible. She put her lunch container on top of them. Added a book she'd been reading. Arranged everything to look casual, unremarkable. Then she sat at her desk and tried to work, tried to process the files still in her queue, tried to act like everything was normal while her bag sat beside her chair containing evidence of systematic government wrongdoing and her own federal crime. The clock on her screen seemed to move backward. 5:03, 5:07. 5:12. At 5:30, she logged out. Put on her cardigan. Picked up her bag with the careful casualness of someone who'd done this exact thing 1,000 times before. "Have a good weekend, Margaret," James called from his desk. "You too," she managed, her voice almost steady. The elevator ride up from the basement took 42 seconds. She counted them. At the ground floor, she walked past the security desk, just Bobby today, looking at his phone, barely glancing up as she passed. Out the front doors into September twilight, the air cool and clean after the basement's stale recycling. She made it 3 blocks before she had to stop, leaning against a bus shelter, breathing hard, her bag pressed against her side like it might escape. What was she doing? What did she think would happen now? She couldn't publish the documents herself, that would be immediate proof of her crime, would destroy any credibility the information might have. She couldn't go to her supervisors, they were part of the system, had been approving these redactions for decades. She thought about journalists. About David Rosen, who'd written about his mother without the documents he'd requested. About the others she'd found, people trying to tell stories the government had worked hard to keep hidden. But approaching a journalist meant exposure, meant investigation, meant the possibility that everything would unravel and she'd end up prosecuted while the real wrongdoing remained buried under classifications and official denials. Margaret started walking again, toward the metro station, letting her feet carry her through familiar motions while her mind raced. She thought about Elizabeth Torres, whose father had been poisoned for $50 and a lie. Elizabeth, who'd filed a FOIA request hoping to understand, who'd received back pages of black rectangles, who'd probably assumed the truth was lost forever. She thought about David Rosen's mother, dead at 41. Patricia Whitfield's brother, dead at 37. The 43 cancer cases in a single Ohio neighborhood. The 11 workers from Montana. The 12 test subjects from New Mexico, no, 17, all 17 were dead now. All those deaths, and between the living and the truth stood people like Margaret, dutiful processors of redactions, guardians of government secrets, complicit through compliance. The metro platform was crowded with Friday commuters. Margaret stood among them, anonymous, ordinary, a middle-aged woman with a canvas bag and a cardigan, invisible in the way bureaucrats become invisible. But inside the bag, the pages seemed to burn. She got on the train. Rode to Silver Spring. Walked to her apartment. Locked the door behind her and leaned against it, finally alone, finally able to stop pretending everything was fine. The documents lay on her kitchen table where she'd emptied her bag. 17 pages. Such a small thing, really. Paper and ink. But they represented a choice, a line she'd crossed, a point from which there might be no return. Margaret made tea she didn't drink. Paced her small apartment as darkness fell outside. Picked up her phone and put it down a dozen times. At 11:37 p.m., she finally made her decision. She opened her laptop and composed an email. Not to a journalist, not yet. First, she needed to know if others had seen what she'd seen, if the pattern extended beyond her own observations. She wrote to 3 other FOIA processors she'd met at conferences over the years, people who worked in different agencies, who reviewed different types of requests. She kept the message vague, careful. Asked if they'd noticed an increase in redaction rates. Mentioned she was working on quality control analysis. Made it sound bureaucratic, boring, official. She sent the emails before she could reconsider. Then she hid the printed pages at the bottom of a box in her bedroom closet, buried under old sweaters and tax returns from years ago. Evidence hidden within evidence of a life lived carefully, properly, within all the rules. Until now. Margaret lay in bed, staring at her ceiling, and waited for morning, for responses, for whatever came next. The documents were out there now, outside the system. The truth had escaped its cage, even if only by 17 pages, even if only into the hands of one frightened woman who didn't yet know what to do with it. But she would figure it out. She had to. Because those names, those 17 names on 17 pages, deserved more than black rectangles and bureaucratic silence. They deserved to be known. Chapter 5, The Cost of Truth. The responses came Sunday afternoon. Margaret was sitting in her apartment, still in her pajamas at 3 o'clock, drinking her 4th cup of coffee, when her laptop chimed. The first email was from Robert Chen, a processor at the Department of Defense. His response was brief, almost curt, "Not sure what you mean. Redaction rates seem normal to me. Good luck with your analysis." The second was from Linda Vasquez at Health and Human Services. Longer, more thoughtful, interesting you should ask. I've been wondering the same thing lately. Would prefer to discuss by phone if you're serious about this. The third never came. Margaret would learn later that the processor she'd contacted at the FDA had forwarded her email to his supervisor, who'd forwarded it to security, who'd opened a file with Margaret's name on it. But in that moment, she only knew that Linda Vasquez had seen it too. She wasn't alone. They spoke Tuesday evening, after Margaret had endured 3 days of ordinary work, ordinary conversations with James, ordinary pretense that nothing had changed. Linda's voice on the phone was quiet, careful. "I have a file," Linda said. Clinical trial from 2008. Children with asthma. The drug caused heart problems in 6 kids. All of it redacted before release. Company claimed commercial confidentiality. We approved it. Are they alive? Margaret asked. The children? A pause. 4 of them. They talked for an hour. Compared notes, shared observations, danced around the central question neither wanted to ask directly: what do we do now? It was Linda who finally said it. There's a reporter. Daniela Voss. She did that series on VA hospital scandals. She's thorough. Careful. Doesn't burn sources. Margaret wrote down the name with a hand that barely shook anymore. Fear had become something else over the past days. Something harder. Something like resolve. She spent a week preparing. Made copies of the New Mexico documents. Gathered her list of patterns, her archive searches, her evidence of systematic abuse. Built a case the way she'd learned to build cases in graduate school, when she'd still believed in institutions, in process, in the possibility of justice through proper channels. She met Daniela Voss in a coffee shop in Baltimore, far enough from Washington that she might not be recognized. Voss was younger than Margaret expected, maybe 35, with tired eyes that suggested she'd heard too many stories like the one Margaret was about to tell. Margaret talked for 2 hours. Showed her the documents, the patterns, the proof. Watched Voss's expression shift from professional interest to something darker. You understand what this means for you, Voss said finally. When this publishes, they'll know where it came from. There aren't many people with your level of access. They'll investigate. You'll lose your job. Possibly face charges. I know, Margaret said. And she did. She'd thought about nothing else for 2 weeks. Why now? Voss asked. After 17 years, why now? Margaret thought about David Rosen's mother. About Elizabeth Torres's father. About the 4 children still alive who'd been given a dangerous drug, about all the people who'd filed FOIA requests hoping to understand what had happened to them, to their families, to their communities. Because I finally saw it, she said. The pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can't keep being part of it. The article published 6 weeks later. Front page of the Washington Post, then picked up everywhere. Systematic redaction abuse hid government wrongdoing for decades. Daniela Voss's byline. Margaret's evidence, carefully anonymized but unmistakable to anyone who knew the system. The investigation started within hours. Margaret was placed on administrative leave on a Tuesday morning. Same basement office, same fluorescent lights, but this time Rita Clarkson sitting across from her with 2 people from internal security, asking questions Margaret answered carefully, truthfully, with a calmness that surprised her. She was fired on Thursday. Security clearance revoked. Escorted from the building by a guard who wouldn't meet her eyes. 17 years reduced to a cardboard box of personal items, her thermos, a few photos, a coffee mug someone had given her for her 50th birthday. The criminal investigation took longer. In the end, they couldn't quite decide what to charge her with. The documents she'd taken were classified, but they'd been improperly classified. The redactions she'd exposed were procedurally correct but substantively corrupt. The system had broken its own rules so thoroughly that prosecuting her for revealing it seemed dangerous, likely to draw more attention to the underlying scandal. They settled for revoking her pension, banning her from federal employment, and making it clear she'd never work in archives again. Margaret got a job at a public library in Silver Spring. Reshelving books, helping patrons with computer questions, ordering supplies. Minimum wage, no benefits. She was 54 years old and starting over. But the article had consequences beyond her own life. Congressional hearings. Inspector General investigations. Policy reforms promised if not yet delivered. And gradually, slowly, the stories started coming out. The Montana facility workers, their exposures finally documented. The New Mexico test subjects, their names released to their families. The Ohio contamination, the Michigan drug trial, the Nevada military exercise. Truth emerging from decades of redaction, incomplete and belated but real. David Rosen wrote her a letter. So did Elizabeth Torres. So did 47 other people whose FOIA requests had been stonewalled, whose questions had been met with black rectangles, who thought the truth was lost forever. Margaret kept the letters in a folder in her apartment. Read them sometimes, when the reality of her minimum wage job and her lost pension and her uncertain future felt too heavy. She'd made a choice. It had cost her almost everything. But on the days when doubt crept in, when she wondered if it had been worth it, she thought about those 17 names from New Mexico. Test subjects who'd been erased from their own story, reduced to redacted space. They had names now. The living knew what had happened to the dead. It wasn't justice, exactly. The people responsible were retired or dead themselves. The companies involved had been dissolved or restructured beyond accountability. The systems that had allowed it all continued, reformed perhaps, but not transformed. But it was something. A crack in the wall of official silence. A reminder that truth, even buried, remained true. That witnesses, even complicit ones, could choose to testify. Margaret Chen, former archivist, current library clerk, walked home through Silver Spring twilight on a Friday evening 17 months after her world had ended and begun again. The documents were no longer redacted beyond recognition. And neither was she.